Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. This is the first video in a mini-series I'm going to be doing, based on the book The Idea of the Brain by Matthew Cobb. I want to take you back in time and track down the evolution of neuroscience, from prehistoric times up until last century. The reason I'm only covering it until the 20th century is because I want to touch on modern neuroscience later on, and I think a look back into how we got to this stage is perfect for starting the channel on the right foot. Now in this video, we're gonna be seeing how people thought about the brain from prehistoric times up until the 17th century. I know it sounds like a lot, but you'll see that new breakthroughs used to take a long time to happen, so progress was very slow. But without further ado, let's begin. Our capacity to create abstract thoughts and ideas is unrivaled in the animal kingdom. For millennia, we have been creating stories, developing ever more advanced tools, and manipulating forms of energy, all through the usage of this single organ, which sits at the top of our body. A look into most common languages spoken today will give us an insight into how previous generations viewed the relationship between our cognitive abilities and emotions and the brain, or rather, how they did not see a relationship. Words like heartfelt and expressions such as learn by heart indicate how early civilizations mostly viewed the heart as the main focus of all things associated with the brain nowadays. These examples may be limited, but through simple research, we can observe how emotions, reasoning, senses, and many more functions now associated with the brain were, in prehistoric times, seen as an obvious creation of the heart. From the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest forms of story and myth creation known to historians, to the Vedic Sanskrit hymns, one of the four sacred canonical Hindu texts, and even the Torah or the Bible's Old Testament, all signs, and by signs I mean stories, point to the idea that the heart, and not the brain, generates thoughts and emotions. Many more examples of this can be found in other civilizations as well, such as the Maya and Aztecs, and, according to Cobb, most people native to America believe the same thing. Not just in America and the Mediterranean, but in Asia too, the general belief seems to have been that the heart ruled the body through its control over the five senses, emotions, and cognition in general. In Egypt too, the Shabaka stone is evidence of this belief. The one exception to this trend seems to be that of the Australian Aborigines, which did not seem to share this belief. As such, due to this prehistoric preconception, the ancient world's views on the brain were very clear. It served no specific purpose. However, this is not to say that some thinkers didn't disagree. One example of this was Alcmaeon of Croton, who seems to have been the first Greek philosopher to propose the brain to have a central function in human understanding, or at least the first one we have a record of. Despite support from Plato and Hippocrates, amongst others, this revolutionary idea, put forward by Alcmaeon, would eventually be cast into oblivion, due to Aristotle's stiff support for the heart as the center of sensation and reasoning. Due to their respect for the great Greek philosopher, later generations would not take a liking to Alcmaeon's theory and would straight up dismiss it. Unfortunately, this caused the brain to be ignored for centuries more, especially as further civilizations, such as the Romans, looked back to Aristotle as the main source of scientific knowledge. Over time, this view started to change, and it was exactly from Greece, at this point in time under the rule of the Roman Empire, that one of the biggest influences in how we see the brain and its study nowadays came from. Unfortunately, this required awful experiments to be conducted, so I'll try to be quick in describing them and jump over the more gruesome details. Essentially, Galen of Pergamon, a physician and philosopher, demonstrated how squeezing an animal's heart and preventing it from beating would not prevent the animal from making sounds, whilst doing so to its brain would turn the animal unconscious. Horrible as they sound, these experiments were actually conducted in front of a live audience and, more crucially, were done with Aristotle's supporters present. By staging experiments like these, Galen was actively changing people's heart-centric views in the late Roman Empire and demonstrating the importance of nerves and the brain. This showmanship is what allowed his experiments to remain influential for thousands of years. Unfortunately, however, it wasn't long until the Western Roman Empire fell, and, with it, any possibility of further experiments being conducted was pretty much squashed. Even though a lot of knowledge was lost with the fall of Rome, the Islamic world was producing a lot of new ideas and works during the medieval period. But even though this period saw a lot of great scholars and thinkers, due to the importance that Hellenic classical works still retained in this culture, we once again go headfirst into Aristotle's heart-centric views, as they were the norm, and scholars such as Avicenna, whose actual name is showing up on screen because I refuse trying to pronounce it, arguing that although Galen was right in some aspects, such as his proposition that nerves arise from the brain and spinal cord, at the end of the day, it was still true that the heart was at the center of movement and sensation, like Aristotle argued. Around the same time period, the physician known in the West as Ali Abbas translated Galen's work and expanded on it by adding one of the most influential ideas of this time period to Galen's. His argument was that not only was the brain the source of emotions, cognition, and the five senses, but that the three ventricles on the brain contained animal spirits, each having a function relating to human functions, such as sensation in the anterior ventricle, intellect on the middle ventricle, and motion and memory in the posterior one. This idea was not originated by Ali Abbas. It was, in fact, a very influential theory of how the brain worked from the 4th up until the 16th century, and was widely accepted by most people and thinkers. Due to its influence, it is not surprising that Ali Abbas attempted to converge it with Galen's own theories and beliefs, in order to give both of them a rise in popularity and believability. From these two examples, we can see how influential Galen's experiments had become by this point, with most thinkers having to somehow find ways to explain them, whether they agreed with Galen or not. This should tell us how important it is to conduct empirical experiments, and it really should have made people from the time want to conduct said experiments themselves. Because discussing classical works was common practice, eventually, Aristotle's heart-centric views once again came to dominate popular thinking, making it so that Avicenna's theories, which successfully combined both Galen's studies on the nerves and Aristotle's views on the heart, became the accepted way of thinking. Once again, the brain was relegated to playing second fiddle to the heart. And it would take around 400 years for this to finally change. A fundamental moment for the understanding of the brain's role in our cognitive functions came with it becoming socially and culturally accepted to dissect human bodies in the name of science. As despite this practice being common in classical Greece, it became increasingly frowned upon over the years since, preventing any empirical experiments on the human body and brain. Even Galen refrained from doing his experiments in humans, and even avoided doing them on monkeys as much as possible, due to their resemblance to us. This began changing, however, in the 14th century, when Mondino di Luzzi did his first dissections on the human body, massively furthering knowledge of our physiology and demonstrating how experimental evidence trumps theoretical discussions of earlier works. I cannot emphasize enough how this change in paradigm single-handedly changed human history, as over time scientists and physicians were allowed to make their own observations on the human body. Due to this, as the European Renaissance rolled around, Knowledge of the human body increased, and, with the invention of the printing press, images of open skulls started to be published, most notably by Andreas Vesalius, in his masterpiece De Humani Corporis Fabrica. Importantly, Vesalius claimed Galen was wrong and that he had found no evidence of any animal spirits in the human brains he observed, and instigated students to do their own empirical observations on the human brain. The discourse around the human brain was, once again, revived. What a time to be a physician this must have been. One massive problem, however, was that researchers could not find any empirical evidence of the brain's actual role. They could only describe it, and then take a side on the Aristotle versus Galen argument. Despite this, the brain was becoming increasingly more popular as the preferred answer to this question, becoming more and more important in scientific circles around the 17th and 18th century. The study of the brain's anatomy was fundamental in this period, as certain traits which stand out were studied by thinkers to generate theories and propositions on how the brain truly worked, such as the pineal gland by Descartes. Despite the physiological advancements of this time, the brain was still very much seen as mostly tissue and not a place where the mind could be found, with Descartes' idea of the mind-body duality itself playing a very influential factor in views of the brain's function and importance. During this time, some other popular theories used hydraulic and pneumatic models at large to describe how animals and humans moved. These were based on hydraulic automata, very popular amongst French elites, which suggested animals and humans moved using the passing of spirits or fluids throughout the body. In the late 17th century, Nicolaus Steno gave one of the most important talks in the history of neuroscience, as he urged researchers to take the brain apart, to observe how it works, just as we do with machines. This idea was revolutionary and went on to define neuroscientific research until today, as studies using brain injuries, for example, follow this exact recipe. This view on research also indicated a big change in analogies used from then on to describe humans, as these would now mostly focus on machines. By the late 17th century, the brain was mostly accepted to be the origin of emotions and cognition, and physicians were now starting to delve more and more into its workings and fundamental processes. Work in the future centuries would increasingly focus on certain areas giving rise to certain behaviors, and neuroscientific arguments would increase in both number and complexity. As such, a later video will cover these. Now, to wrap up the video, I would like to have a small discussion on what we can observe from all this neuroscience history covered today. A fundamental theme I think we can see is that theories of brain functioning, or even simply of thought and emotion creation, have always been, and continue to be, prisoners of their own time. This is a result of the biases and concerns shared by those who developed them, and, in my opinion, this means that by looking at the way previous generations thought about the brain, we can gain a deeper understanding of our own biases and shortcomings, something which I think is not done enough by current scientists. Causes for this might be either that they are too busy, or that there is only so much one can look back before getting too stuck in the complexities of past times, which is understandable. However, it is still very important that we do this process once in a while, and I don't think it is controversial to say this applies to everyone who is interested and wants to understand any topic deeply. One great example of these shortcomings and biases is how the understanding of the brain is always linked to the technologies developed at the time, in the form of analogies. As such, just as nowadays the brain is seen as a computer of sorts, earlier generations of philosophers and thinkers compared the brain to inventions such as the automata in the 18th century and piston pumps in the 15th century. This fact is necessary to put into perspective how locked inside our own time we still are, and how much neuroscience itself needs to progress in its understanding of the human brain. In order to write up the script for this video, I mainly used the book The Idea of the Brain by Matthew Cobb, as it is a very good description of the evolution of scientific thinking about the brain. This video is focusing only on progress until the 18th century, with videos on the 19th, 20th, and present centuries coming out later on. Before I wrap up this video, however, I want to point out the references can be found in the description, and that this will always be the case for all my videos. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, as that massively helps the channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.